Hello and welcome everyone back to week 4 of production of the College Sports Hive. Once again, this is Leif and Scott Stevens bringing you our news episode for the week. Just a quick rundown of what we have on the docket for this episode. We have 6 programs now who are in the national spotlight for their dealings with COVID issues this week. We will update you on how Trevor Lawrence is doing and the updates on that realm of things. Also, there was a pretty gruesome hit to Kyle Pitts, Florida's star tight end, last weekend in that Georgia game. We will update you on how he's doing, as he's a huge part of that offense. And then we have a couple injuries on the Michigan defense. They have a big game upcoming this weekend against Wisconsin, who is one of those teams that we will update you on with COVID issues. So that game's still kind of up in the air, but if that's being played this week, Michigan will be without some key pieces there on defense. And then to wrap up the rest of the episode, we'll touch on how the rankings have shifted this week and talk about where teams fall, where teams rise to. It was a big weekend with a lot of ranked matchups, so some teams fluctuating there for sure. So to get us kicked off here, we're going to start in the world of COVID issues. It seems like it's the hot topic in the sports world all over the place the last year. We're going to start actually here in Salt Lake City. The University of Utah has a big issue with COVID. None of us really know the extent of how big this COVID issue is, but it was a big enough issue to cancel their game this past weekend against Arizona at home because the University of Utah was not able to roster 53 scholarship players. Leif, what do we know about this moving forward?
Well, first of all, it came as a total shock on Friday afternoon before a Saturday kickoff, and it came out of nowhere. We had heard nothing, and we're both University of Utah students, so we were both taken aback. What we've heard now is that the game is supposed to happen, scheduled. It's supposed to kick off, but we're still waiting for confirmation. Coach Kyle Whittingham has said he had 2 position groups completely decimated by COVID-19. And they had one player had a very rough go of it. Quote, he was almost hospitalized. So I think they've had a tough go of the whole thing, and I think they have just enough, based off what I'm hearing on some local Twitter, to just enough scholarship players to get this underway. But expect them to have some names that you may not have heard of if you're a Utah fan.
Yeah, and this raises the question that a lot of people are dealing with this season, and it's the reporting of these issues throughout sports. We've seen a lot of schools, like for example, when Florida initially happened, it felt like they did a decent job of reporting their COVID cases and actually telling us what was happening. For this to come out of the blue, because to put this into perspective for everyone, to not be able to have a roster with 53 scholarship players, you're looking at something to the extent that Florida had of 20, I would say, to 30 players who have tested positive for COVID-19. So that's very astounding to the sports world and to us in general. I just remember I was in shock. I was just like, what the heck is going on here? Because in my eyes, there's no way that this many players woke up that morning of Friday morning and all got tested and all came back positive just out of the blue. You know what I mean? So I think there's a big issue in how they were reporting this, how they were being transparent about what was happening here, and the lack thereof of that transparency. So, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I know we talked about this off camera. We were disappointed because we thought Florida. I mean, it looked terrible, and same with Wisconsin. It looked really bad after a game, and especially after Dan Mullen's quote of wanting to fill up the swamp, and it looked bad. But at least they were transparent and honest about what happened. And I'm with you. I'm a skeptic that everyone got sick in the day before the game. So I wish we had heard that that there were rumblings of it. I mean, I feel bad for the people who had made plans to watch this game and stuff, and obviously not in the stadium, but there's a lot of people who are working to promote the team, and they weren't even aware, to my knowledge. So it's hard to see people be so in the dark, and because we're so used to having an age of transparency with all the social media and sports, and COVID-19 has really changed that this year, because sometimes we don't even know who's playing. Like we mentioned that last podcast, we have no idea who's playing some weekends.
Yeah, and it just seems like there's a complete lack of ownership of what happened here in the program. Like we don't have any names, we don't have any like that happened with Florida and Wisconsin mostly as well. That there weren't a lot of names broadcasted, but there was numbers. There was um, there was transparency in the fact that these members of the team itself, the players, and then members of the coaching staffs had tested positive. We got both of those breakdowns. We haven't heard anything from the University of Utah program about just how many people had it, how many coaches have it, what's happening around here. And this is coming after a weekend of Halloween weekend, which for most college universities is one of their biggest weekends, you know what I mean? Of like going out and having fun and all of that good stuff that college players do. So so I'm not necessarily surprised that this has happened. I'm just very, very quite honestly shocked at how poorly the University of Utah has handled this scenario, in my personal opinion. Um, and and I think it's one of those things that it might be happening even more so across the country with other programs that might have these same problems. And what scares me the most is would the U have like actually come out and said the game's canceled if they had enough, if they had like 56 scholarship players, you know what I mean? So like there's this issue of transparency that you need to have, and it's past like just letting the media know and people like that know. It's player safety, it's the campus safety, it's all of these things happening for, and there's a lot of people that get affected by decisions like this, and I think it was just very poorly handled in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And just adding on to that is, I think it's a national issue that they decided we need college football, so we're going to cram this into a set amount of games, and there's not much wiggle room for the Pac-12 and Big Ten. Whereas what the SEC did, and I agreed with the Pac-12 and Big Ten trying to not play football. Frankly, I love college football, and I think it's an amazing product. But when there's a pandemic, some considerations have to be taken. And I think what the Pac-12 and Big Ten did is they were really good, and they found a company that allowed them to get daily testing, and it's worked for the most part. And yes, we highlight the ones that don't work just because that's newsworthy. But that said, there's not much wiggle room. So then you're trying to force games because there's not anywhere to put the makeup games. So I think what's going to happen is I think Utah will play this weekend against UCLA. And I think, like you said, they could have 56 players, maybe 60, but they certainly won't have all 80, 85, 90, that could be playing. And I think it's an unfortunate reality of what's happening now, and I think it'll continue to happen. And in the game of football, you need players. It's a physical sport, and so I think that's not only the University of Utah, but everywhere. And Salt Lake City is being hit really hard right now. So I think it may not even be the athletes' fault. I think it's just hitting everywhere in Salt Lake City. So it's happening nationally, and that's just my thought of a national scheduling issue, and because of the money that college football makes.
Yeah, I agree. I think it leads to another argument too of the NCAA allowed the conferences the ownership to kind of dictate how their scheduling was going to work and things like that. And I think if there was a mandate set by the NCAA from the very beginning and said, look, you guys are going to be able to play, but you have to follow by these specific guidelines, and everyone needs this and this. I think you could see some differences happening than things that we've seen happening, because right now you look at 5 different conferences, if you're just looking at the Power Five, and there's a bunch of other ones as well that all have different mandates, all have different guidelines, all have different schedules. And it's just kind of a mess right now of just, if people get sick, you just fill them in and play your game. And it's just kind of like this weird chaotic scenario of what even is happening throughout the entire scope of the country, because each program and each case like something like this happens is different because they're under different guidelines, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting because would Trevor Lawrence be allowed to play? Like, I know he couldn't play against Notre Dame, and it was 2 weeks removed. Would he have been allowed to play in the Pac-12 or the SEC? And those type of things people don't think about, but it really is impactful to this season.
Absolutely. Speaking of games that are unlikely to happen this weekend, it's looking more and more like the Alabama LSU this game this weekend is going to be postponed due to LSU COVID issues. What news do we have out of the LSU camp there?
The only news that I've seen is Ed Orgeron, the head coach of LSU, the defending national champion, said that they don't think they're going to have a lot of people available. And so far, we haven't heard of official postponement. But I think just on the erring on the side of caution is certainly necessary, and I fully expect that one to be canceled in the coming days.
It's an LSU team that's already shorthanded on defense. They've gotten exposed throughout numerous facets of their games this season with a really tough matchup against Alabama. That game's always a rivalry game, always close, always fun to watch. So a lot of people were looking forward to this game, but it's looking more and more likely that this isn't going to happen this weekend. If this does get canceled or postponed, we will have that for you on Thursday. We will fill that in. We'll fill that blank in. Geez, excuse me. And then speaking along the terms of SEC teams with outbreaks, do we have any other news out of Mississippi State, because they have a COVID issue as well?
Yeah, Mississippi State announced that they had a pretty sizable COVID outbreak. They only have scholarship players available around the mid 40s. So we mentioned that the Pac-12 you need 53. It depends per conference, and they've only gotten 40 to 50, as Mike Leach, the head coach of Mississippi State, released. So they're clearly not playing. They've postponed their game against Auburn. And it'll be interesting to monitor how quickly Mississippi State and the Starkville community is able to get that one going again.
Flipping the script a little bit to teams that are bouncing back a little bit from COVID issues, we've touched on Florida, how they've played, and they've played well, coming back off of their COVID hiatus. Wisconsin has started picking up their light football activities. They're only down to 5 cases now. Do we have any other updates as to what's happening there in Madison?
Yeah, that's the latest update I saw. I think 5 cases and light football activity is the last update we've gotten, and I'm excited to see Wisconsin come back, because I mean, last we saw them, Graham Mertz went 20 of 21 for 5 touchdowns, and you know, they always have good O-line play, so it'll be awesome to see a good team come back.
Yeah, this is an interesting story because we touched on they do have a game scheduled this weekend against Michigan, who's on the skid, not really playing very good football as of right now. And you have a team like Wisconsin who's going to have issues regardless of what happens here. They're going to have time off. They're going to have rust. They're going to have stamina issues. You don't know who those 5 cases are right now that are still positive. So we're not sure who's going to even take the field. So this one's also going to be one of those featured in the Thursday preview episode of just what necessarily to expect from this Wisconsin team if they even are able to play this game, if things continue to progress the way they've been progressing and having these positive movements in the right direction. So we watched a game, the best game of the weekend. Notre Dame knocks off number 1 Clemson this weekend at home. And what do we see happen right after that happened?
They rushed the field, and I mean, I don't blame the students. That's got to be exhilarating, but in these special times, call for special measures, and you got to use your head over your heart in that one, in my opinion. And right as that happened, I know we both thought it, and I'm sure tons of people thought it, that was silly. But as a result, Notre Dame mandates testing after storming a field, so that's both for their athletes as well as all the students in attendance of the game. So I think it's a good precaution, and I'm sure there will be some positive tests out of South Bend, but hopefully nothing too disastrous.
Yeah, it's just one of those things that we get it. We understand you just knocked off the number 1 team in the country. It's very, as you touched on, very exhilarating and all that good stuff. And I love seeing that pageantry and that passion of the students for college football. It's one of the things that I love about it the most. But also at the same time, it is head over heart. Like, you got to be smart. You know the times that we're in. You know how volatile things like these are. Having that many people on the field. I don't know if you guys have seen the photo. We might be able to put it up for you, but it was one of those things that kind of blew me away personally. And it was one of those things that was like, wow, can you imagine if something like this were to lead to an outbreak in a Notre Dame team who just had their biggest win of the season and everything's looking up for them in the ACC. So that was just kind of my quick takeaway. Like, wow, was that really necessary? I understand it, but also it was one of those things that a lot of people had differing opinions on.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, though, is I'm surprised that they hadn't like barricaded the field from that happening. And the other thing is, another thing I heard on Twitter was people were mad at Notre Dame for even rushing the field, not even because of COVID issues, just because they were the 4th ranked team in the country. They're like, you shouldn't rush a field if you beat someone. You should be beating them. And I think those are some like older people who've got this like, hey, we're the best scenario, you know, and I'm sure that they've proven they are one of the best teams, but I think in this scenario, I'm surprised that more teams haven't blocked off a field just because of safety precautions. And you know, like, you don't rush the field that often, but why allow it in this type of era? Like if it were normal times, absolutely rush the field, have some fun. But I'm frankly surprised that more teams don't have little barricades or at least guards and not allowing that to happen.
Absolutely, and that in that mandated testing for Notre Dame, that's a test that needs to be taken before you travel for Thanksgiving, and after you come back, and then travel home again for Christmas. So I think you're going to start to see a lot of college universities kind of follow suit. I know there's already talk for just us because we are students. We're involved in what's happening up at the University of Utah. They've been talking about doing very similar things of having tests mandated before you go home for Thanksgiving to ensure that you're not causing more of the spread, even if you don't have any symptoms. So I think you can see something like this happening more and more around college campuses, that people mimic this issue. And it was honestly kind of crazy that it all kind of started just because of the rushing the field here in Notre Dame. So really interesting little anecdote there. The last kind of COVID issue we'll touch on is number 5 Texas A&M. They're having a very good season. They beat Florida. Their only loss right now is to number 2 Alabama. Number 1 Alabama now, as we'll touch on in the rankings. Just was ingrained in my mind. They have halted practices after a few positive COVID tests there in College Station. Do we have any further updates as to what's happening there? How many like any of these information? I know everything's kind of been up in the air, but what we got there?
Yeah, I all I know is that they halted practice on starting on Sunday after the game. I don't know what was the cause of an outbreak or anything, but it's undisclosed. And they said a few. They didn't say many. Coach Jimbo Fisher said that they should be able to play this week, but it's always something to monitor because you don't know how it will be contagious, because obviously it's wildly contagious. So something to monitor, but hopefully nothing too crazy.
Absolutely, and even a few practices off is something that's noteworthy, because teams like this, it's all about the continuity of the offense, of the defense, of the units and things like that, and in this sport. So anytime you miss reps and anything like that, it's noteworthy. So hopefully that is limited to just a few positive cases strewn throughout their program. But once again, that is a situation that we will continue to monitor for all of you guys out there. And kind of another good anecdote about a COVID-19 issue. We touched on that we will talk about Trevor Lawrence in this episode. He is officially back and ready to practice. Do we have any further updates on what's happening there? They do have a bye week this week, so they're off this weekend, and they will be back the weekend following. So I think he should be back and ready to more than ever to play that game.
Yeah, no, I no updates, but it's always great to hear that Trevor Lawrence, one of the best players in college football, if not the best player in college football, is back, and he makes college football. He's the poster boy right now. Whether he wins the Heisman, whether he wins some of these awards, he is the poster boy of college football. So it's great to have him back and healthy, and not to our knowledge, not too impacted by the virus.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of those things that he is the best player, but also it's one of those things that for Clemson it's just very like comforting news. DJ played so well in his 2 game like spell of Trevor Lawrence to come in as the backup and perform in that way was completely admirable. I think he has such a bright future ahead of him, but there's nothing that is better for a football team than having their guy that we touched on. Like Zach Wilson is that guy. Kyle Trask is that guy. There's a lot of teams that just go around the heartbeat of that quarterback position, and you see it happen even in the NFL with Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs, and examples like that. You can go on and on about how you need your guy, and Trevor Lawrence is absolutely that guy for Clemson.
Yeah, he's not only a great football player, but he's their leader too. And I think that was an underrated aspect of what happened in Clemson, Notre Dame, and even Boston College and Clemson. I think that DJ did a great job. He took care of the ball. He did his job, but the playbook was limited just because of there's lack of continuity between DJ and the receivers, whereas Trevor Lawrence has worked with these guys for 3 years. And I think that was really important. And then one thing I forgot to mention that we'll touch on again, I'm sure, is Clemson didn't have Justin Ross this season, and I think we finally saw them exposed for that. And when you're missing your probably 2 best players on paper coming in, even with ETN, like at least your best 2 draft prospects coming into the season, it matters. And so I think that's just something that's great to see Trevor Lawrence back.
Absolutely. Speaking of speaking of people missing time, Florida tight end star Kyle Pitts is questionable with concussion after a pretty gruesome hit that he took in that game against Georgia. I'm not necessarily sure it was. I think both players honestly took a lick from that hit. I'm not sure what the status of the safety was that hit him there. It was a head-to-head targeting call, I believe, and it was just one of those things that you hate to see in the game, and it took out probably their best receiver there at the tight end position for sure for the University of Florida. What do we know out of that camp in regards to Kyle Pitts' condition?
Yeah, I saw that he was questionable for the upcoming game, and I don't know about the Georgia safety, but I'll just say that was the biggest hit I've seen all of college football or NFL this season. That was like earth shattering. Like you felt that through the TV, and I hope both are okay. And Pitts tried to come back in, but he just didn't look right. He had his composition he was rattled, and of course he would be. That was a hit and a half, and I hope both players are okay.
Absolutely. Speaking of injuries, we touched on. We'll talk about Michigan and their defense. Right now, they have defensive end Aiden Hutchinson having surgery on his leg, and another guy injured on their defense as well. What do we know about this? With this happening in Ann Arbor?
Yeah, Aiden Hutchinson is a defensive end. He's a junior who could be a top 2 or 3 round first. He could even crack the first round, but probably a second or third round pick. And he missed the game against Indiana, and he's probably out for the season since it's a condensed season. He's having surgery. And then fellow defensive end, who's projected first round pick, Kwity Paye, is injured, but it doesn't seem to be as serious. And we haven't heard any updates from there. But I expect him to miss the game against Wisconsin.
So yeah, two very important injuries there on the defensive side of the ball for Michigan. They've been kind of struggling, stumbling, fumbling their way through their last few games. A lot of mistakes on both sides of the football, just kind of getting away from their identity, as we touched on in recap games against their last 2 games. What do we expect from this Michigan team if this Wisconsin game is going to be able to go?
Well, I mean, I think this is going to be a really tough game. Yeah, Wisconsin's got an identity, and they don't stray to it too much. And the fact that they were able to add to their identity with Graham Mertz throwing the ball really well really worries me if I'm Michigan, especially considering that they do not play well from behind. So if Wisconsin even has most of their starters, I think Wisconsin should roll in this game, and we'll get to that on our preview. But this doesn't look good for Jim Harbaugh in Michigan. They're straying from their identity, and they have the talent. It's just a bad look regardless of the year. I know there's some compromising situations, but it's hard to be as talented on paper and performing as poorly as they are and retaining a job. So I don't expect to see Jim Harbaugh at Michigan too much longer.
Yeah. Do you think they'll make that move in the midst of this season, even if they fall to 1-3? Do you think that'll be an off-season move?
I think that's right after the season. I know in some the NFL they call it Black Monday, like after the season, and so I think that'll be something, maybe a Sunday for college football because they play on Saturday. But it doesn't look good, and I don't expect him to fare through the season unless they really turn it around.
It just seems like they're not ready to play most games. Quite honestly, they had so many offsides, like you touched on the first half of that last game. And they're just like undisciplined plays that you don't necessarily see from a team like Michigan. This is a powerhouse in the Big Ten. They are easily the top 3 best programs in this conference. And so to see them kind of just completely just lost is quite honestly quite shocking. And I think there's been a lot of leeway with how Jim Harbaugh has kind of run this team, and him just being able to be given the reins to say, look, this is your organization, run it how you want. He's supposed to be this dynamic developer of quarterbacks, and they have not had that in these last few years under Harbaugh. So I just think there's got to be something that gives, and I'm not sure. I don't know if it's all Jim Harbaugh's fault, but it's one of those things that it seems like he's lost the locker room, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's not all his fault. And I think often the scapegoat is either a star player or a head coach. And I think that in this case, I think coaching really has played a factor. I mean, how often have you ever seen a team jump off sides 5 times in one half, much less a game, like even in a game, but much less one half. So I think that doesn't look good. And I think the other thing is he's had intrigue with NFL head coaching spots, and he did well there for the 49ers a while ago. So I wouldn't be surprised to see him transition back to the NFL and say, hey, college, this isn't really my thing right now. I'm struggling here. I'm not doing well. And you get professionals, and maybe motivation's less important as a head coach in the NFL rather than motivating college kids who have other things going on in their lives.
Needless to say, it's a very tough situation there in Michigan to kind of bounce around what's happening with whose fault is it, what's happening here. That whole ball is going to continue to circle and to roll. And unfortunately, it looks like it's rolling in the wrong direction for that program as of right now. Let's dive into the rankings a little bit this week. We had a lot of ranked matchups. People fell, people rose. Biggest jumps of the year were only by 3 spots. Indiana moved up from 13 to 10, and then Liberty, after their win over Virginia Tech, jumped up from 25 to 22. What do we think about Indiana kind of slotted in at that number 10 spot? We touched about this a little bit on our recap. We thought that's where that was going to kind of fall. Do we think they have a chance to continue to build this rise and even build upon that number 10 ranking?
I guess I'm happy they slotted it at 10 because that's what we predicted. So I'll start there. But I don't know. I'm still a skeptic, and I wonder if that's just wrong of me because they traditionally haven't been a great football program. But they've shown me glimpses, and I think Michael Penix Jr. has been really good, as you mentioned. He's a heartbeat type of quarterback of that team. But their defense has a little bit left to be desired, in my opinion. So I don't think they're going to move up anymore. Maybe even a spot. Maybe if they get lucky and some people above them lose. But I don't think they're going to get too much higher than 10. But I'm happy to see it. What's traditionally a basketball state do well in football.
It's really interesting to look ahead a few weeks. You have Indiana is going to play Ohio State here soon. And that's one of the, who would have thought at the beginning of this year that Indiana Ohio State was probably going to be the best matchup this season in college football until we see, in the Big Ten, until we see a potential conference championship between Wisconsin or Ohio State. Don't sleep on Northwestern though. They're 3-0 in that West Division. So Wisconsin might have some problems if they're missing some pieces there against that Northwestern team.
Yeah, they've really flown under the radar. They seem to always do. They always produce quality teams out there in Illinois.
Absolutely. The biggest fall of the weekend was Georgia. They fell 7 spots from number 5 to number 12. You pretty much got that one too. What do we think about that move? And do we think that's justified? Do we think they should have fallen further? Not as far? What do you think? Where do you see Georgia, I guess, in a sense, moving forward?
Yeah, no. So when we were talking about it, I kind of thought about it logically, and I thought, or even one loss, and there aren't really many one-loss teams here. So that's what I better than 12th best team in the country, but I don't know. I think 12th is apt right now, but they're better than 12th best in the country in terms of quality, in my opinion.
So you cut out there a little bit when moving forward in that first little bit of it. What do you want to kind of repeat what you said at the beginning there?
Yeah, sure. I think I was happy to see them go to 12 because we were kind of prognosticating, and that's exactly where we put them. And I think that it's apt because you've got 2 losses, and both to very marquee, legitimate programs in Alabama and Florida. But you can't put a 2-loss team above an undefeated BYU, for example, or even Indiana. So I thought 12th is completely fair. I think they're better than 12th best team in the country, regardless of how poor their quarterback play is. They just got so much talent and both on both sides of the ball. They're better than 12th in the country, but that's fair for what we've seen so far.
Yeah, and let's touch on the rest of that top 10 there. We have a new number 1 team in the country, and that is Alabama, as I kind of alluded to earlier in this episode. Notre Dame did slide into the number 2 spot this week, up ahead of Ohio State. I think that's very justified. I think to say that you knock off the number 1 team in the country and you stay at 3 is a little bit kind of suspect, especially with only seeing Ohio State play 3 games as of now. So I think that's fair to put Notre Dame there. I think Ohio State, in my opinion, is probably a better football team than Notre Dame. But as of right now, I think it's very fair that they slotted them in at number 2. Ohio State does fall in at number 3. And then Clemson rounds out the top 4. As of right now, they fell from 1 to 4. And then moving forward, we touched on number 5, Texas A&M is there with COVID issues. You then have number 6 Florida, so that's 3 SEC teams in the top 6 as of right now moving forward. And then Cincinnati was jumped by Florida after their win against Georgia, and they are in there next behind them. And then you have BYU, Miami, and Indiana to kind of round out that top 10, and which has kind of just been a wild circus of a ride here in the first few weeks of the college football season. What do we think? What do we make of this top 10 moving forward?
I think there's a little bit of an SEC bias. I don't think Cincinnati's done anything wrong at all. In fact, to me, they've improved their case and they've proven themselves to be a legitimate contender. And all they've gotten is jumped. So they're back. They were at 6. They're at the highest 6 after the Oklahoma State loss last week, moved them up, and they take care of business, winning by 4 scores, and now they're at 7th. And I think that Florida's a really good team. And honestly, I was a little surprised Texas A&M got 5th, but they did beat Florida. So you don't want Florida to be ahead of A&M. So there's some politics involved, but we'll see how it turns out. I think there's more obstacles in the SEC, and that might open up a path for Cincinnati. But that was my big takeaway, that I felt bad for a team that's really balling out, but it's not their fault. They're playing inferior competition compared to Florida and A&M.
Yeah, and I think you look at a team like Cincinnati, is they probably just beat the 3 best teams that you can put in front of them in the American division in 3 consecutive weeks. You have SMU, you have Memphis, and you have Houston. So I think those are teams that all can put up points. They lack a little bit on defense, but they've shown prowess in being able to score just so many points. And if my calculations are correct, they've held each and every one of those teams under 14 points. So I think Cincinnati is one of the more dynamic teams in the country. They're flying under the radar, especially, but it also shows how the AP and the college football playoff rooms kind of view a team like Cincinnati and BYU, because they kind of couple into the same scenario for me, at least periodically, of there's still just this differential between Power 5 teams and non-Power 5 teams, and who have you played, who have you beaten, and to put a 1-loss Florida team and a 1-loss Texas A&M team up ahead of Cincinnati and BYU is very telling as to how these teams are viewed. And I'm not necessarily saying that it's wrong. I'm just saying it's very intriguing to know that the AP poll and the college football playoff views and all of these things will hold that so much higher. And we've seen this over the years, right? We've seen it with UCF. We've seen it with other teams that run the table and say, oh, we should have had a shot. We were the most dominant team in our conference. We dominated everyone you put in front of us. And I think Cincinnati is honestly one of those teams that if you put any one of these other teams in the top 10 outside of the top 4 against them in a New Year's Six bowl, they're gonna beat them. And so that's just one of those things where maybe I'm just a little too high on Cincinnati, but also like I think they're a very solid football team on all 3 phases of the game. So I think it's really interesting to see that Florida and that Texas A&M jump like you touched on. Do you have anything else to add there?
Yeah, no, I was thinking while you're speaking that there's an interesting lack of consistency in the polls, because if you're going to reward who you think's the better team, then do that. But if you're going to reward undefeated teams like they seem to have done, so like for instance BYU at 8th, I think that's fair. But why is Miami ahead of Indiana? They have 1 loss, granted, against Clemson. But there's not much of a discrepancy between Miami and Indiana in terms of team quality. It's not like that, oh, wow, they lost to Clemson, but they're really, really good, like Clemson and Notre Dame. So that's why I think there's an interesting disparity. Are you gonna include teams that are undefeated over teams with 1 loss and 2 losses? Or are you going to take the best teams? And like I mentioned, I think Georgia is better than 12th best in the country. For instance, I'd say Georgia would beat BYU. I think Georgia would probably beat a lot of these teams slightly ranked ahead of them. But it's an interesting thing to say. Like Georgia, you can't put Georgia in the top 10, like I said, because they have 2 losses. But then you also can't put Miami above Indiana. And you know, there's some intriguing things that they need to hash out and be consistent about, because that really does matter and impact what team, like who wants to get into a New Year's Six bowl. Because that's really important to a lot of these teams, and that's what most of these teams are fighting for. Because I think we can reasonably say that three teams are locked into the college football playoff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really intriguing as to, like you say, you mentioned SEC bias, but there's also some ACC bias here. Like if you look at it, you have Notre Dame at number 2, which I think is very fair. Clemson at number 4, which I think is very fair. But then you have this Miami team who's right now slated above an undefeated Indiana, who has beaten 2 ranked teams in their matchups, and in Penn State and Michigan, who are 2 of the best teams year after year in the Big Ten East. So you have this team that's undefeated and done things that they haven't done in so long as a program. And then you have Miami, who's there after getting dismantled by Clemson in their biggest game of the year earlier on. I don't
And
know. It just
they barely beat their last opponent too. They won by
yeah,
3 in an unconvincing victory where they looked sloppy, and
yeah.
Indiana looked sharp.
Yeah, so it's just like I agree. There's some inconsistencies here. I think Miami at number 9. It took me a while to kind of process that as that's a mistake. I think it's a little disrespectful to Indiana to make that happen. Um, and then yeah, do you have anything else to add on that? I kind of cut
And
you
one
off.
thing I
Sorry.
wanted to add is not only on the top 10 is that I thought the Pac-12 they did a good job being consistent. I don't think Oregon showed anything spectacular against Stanford. I don't think USC showed anything spectacular against Arizona State. And Oregon jumped 1 spot to 11, which that's fine because they won and the teams ahead of them moved. So you just shift. And USC stayed solid at 20. So I thought that was good that they didn't put too much weight on one game. So I appreciated that in the poll, and I think that would have been unfair if you were to say, oh, 1-0 Oregon is better than a 3-0 Indiana just because of prestige. So I was happy. I was happy to see that at least some semblance of consistency from that conference.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think they did. I think they got that right for sure in the midst of other things that they may have gotten wrong. And listen, these fluctuate every week, right? So we'll see something different next weekend. We'll have teams prove themselves even a little bit further. Maybe they're just viewing Miami as playing more games at this point than Indiana, and that's why they're there. So there's logical explanations as to why it's happening. It just doesn't sit right with me. In at least at this point in the year. Do you have any final thoughts on the rankings before we kind of
No,
close it out
I
here?
think they're good. I just want to shout out Coastal Carolina, Marshall, and Liberty. They're the underdogs. They're all undefeated and still kicking.
Absolutely. Well, we wish everyone the best of luck moving forward in their games this week. We will have another chock full preview episode for you all on Thursday. We promise we won't take up too much of your time. I know the last week's got a little long, and so we do apologize about that. But moving forward, it's going to be another good weekend of college football. It always is, and I'm sure we'll see some things fluctuating. Please make sure to reach out to us if you have any games that you want us to cover. This is going to be a really good week to get some of those in, some of the teams that we haven't given a lot of the spotlight to in our show. So if you have anything that you want to hear talked about, delving into, we're happy to do that for you. Just reach out to either one of us. We'll be happy to make that happen.
Yep. I think you encapsulated all of it. So thank you.
Yeah. All right, guys. We'll see you all Thursday, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.